The next lesson is about things that could happen when you're working with hypothesis testing. So both of them are errors that we could make. It's when you make the wrong decision after you decide to reject or fail to reject a null hypothesis. So the first one is called a type 1 error. A type 1 error occurs when you reject a true null hypothesis. So what I mean is that if you notice on the right, I have a little box there. So what we decided is we rejected our null hypothesis. We rejected H0. We decided H0 wasn't true. But in reality, it actually was true. So that would be an example of a type 1 error. The type 2 error is when you fail to reject a false null hypothesis. And this one can also be bad. So in reality, what you said was you thought that H0 could be true, or you thought that the HA, the alternative, was not true. Actually, though, in actuality, a type 2 error would mean that the null hypothesis was false, but you said that you didn't know it was false. You didn't think it was false. You thought it was true. So in this case, we call it a type 2 error. Now, the other two things you'll notice in my table are I have two other boxes that I didn't fill in with errors. The top right one would be if I rejected a null hypothesis and the null hypothesis was false. And actually right here, I should say true H0, false H0. If you reject a null hypothesis and the null hypothesis is false, that's a good thing. That means you made the right decision. I'll just put a smiley face there because it's a good thing to do. The other thing is if you fail to reject the null hypothesis, that means that you do not determine that the null hypothesis is false. And if the null hypothesis was actually true, that would be another good decision. So those two are what we want to happen. The errors are what we absolutely do not want to happen, but they could occasionally happen. The other thing that's important to know is that the type 1 error is going to happen with a probability of whatever your alpha level is. So that's one of the things that you might want to remember. The type 2 error, we say that the probability is beta. To be honest, that's not really that important to know. Knowing that a type 1 has a probability of alpha is important. So if you want to reduce your risk of a type 1 error, you have to lower your alpha level. One other thing that might help you remember, it may or may not, but some people like to think of it this way. A type 1 error is what we call a false positive. And a type 2 error is what we call a false negative. Sometimes if people have heard those terms, they make them easier, that makes these easier to understand. So you can decide if that helps you or not. So for the next example, we have a manager of a fast food restaurant, and this manager has found that the proportion of customers who have to wait in the drive-through line longer than 2 minutes is 0.63. So this manager decides to hire somebody else and hopes to reduce the waiting time. So take a look and you can see our hypotheses. The null hypothesis is that the proportion of people who wait more than 2 minutes is the same. It's still 63%. And this is after the new employee has been hired. The alternative is that after this new employee has been hired, the proportion decreases. You find out then if you had the alternative being true, that would mean that the proportion has decreased. So in this case, the manager is hoping that the alternative is true. So let's go through what a type 1 and a type 2 error would be. So a type 1 error, remember, means we reject a true null. And in this case, if the null hypothesis was true, that would mean the proportion stayed the same. But rejecting it would mean that we thought, or the manager thought, that the wait time, that the proportion decreased. So I'll write that out. So the type 1 error would be thinking that the proportion who waited more than 2 minutes had decreased when it actually hadn't. And the second thing that they ask you, by the way, make sure that you're actually answering the question that they ask. So this is a two-parter for each of the errors. They want you to explain the consequences. So this part is using what you wrote for the error and determining what a consequence could be. So you might have a different answer than somebody else. That's fine, as long as it makes sense for the situation. So in this case, if a type 1 error happened, the manager would think that the proportion who waited more than 2 minutes had decreased, but it actually hadn't. This would mean that this manager was paying an employee that wasn't actually helping. So that would be a problem for the manager of this restaurant. And so our consequence would be the manager would keep on an employee that wasn't actually helping. You can say something along those lines. If you think of another consequence that is relevant in this situation, that's fine. But this is the basic thing that would probably happen. So that's a type 1 error. It's up to you which of the two errors you think is worse. Sometimes you'll be asked, like, which error do you think is worse? As long as you back up your response, it's usually okay. So the type 2 error, remember, is when you fail to reject a false null. So failing to reject the null hypothesis here would mean that you would assume that the proportion who wait longer than 2 minutes had not decreased, but it actually has. So in this case, it would be thinking that the proportion who waited more than 2 minutes had not decreased, but it actually had. So for these ones, it's usually, this type of question, the easiest way to solve it and to figure it out is to start by writing out what the null hypothesis and what the alternative actually mean. And usually they're going to be exact opposite. So the consequence of this one would mean that most likely the manager would get rid of this employee because the manager would think this person wasn't helping when they actually were. So you can say anything along those lines, but you kind of have to read between the lines and think about what would actually happen if the manager made this mistake, made this error. I would say that the manager would probably, would maybe even fire this employee that was really helpful, or send the employee somewhere else in the restaurant. An effective employee. And you can see that both of these would cause problems. So they're bad in their own way. There are going to be occasions, especially with like medicines or diagnosing diseases where you'll think that one is much worse than the other. In those cases, you might have to change your alpha level accordingly, just so that you can make sure of not making certain errors. We'll see some examples in class. Feel free to go on and try example number 3. I'm going to tell you right now example number 6. I'm going to tell you it's a lot easier than it seems. Just look back at the stuff that you saw in the beginning of the video if you need some help, but give that a try.